Okay, there's a homework assignment that's due next Monday night, 11 o'clock. It's online, submitted online. So that this might be something new for you, but it shouldn't be. It should be pretty straightforward. There's instructions. If you go to SmartSite tests and quizzes, there should be an announcement that came around by email about this that it has been posted. So what I'm using is the test and quizzes function on SmartSite, but that doesn't mean like it's a quiz, whatever. It's an assessment of some kind, right? So there's what I decided to do was to do a problem on Portuguese, because I can kind of generate stuff from my own head and check it to make sure it's okay. And because it's a little bit different, so it'll give you a chance to apply the kinds of things that we're looking at today in particular, to use that to analyze Portuguese and to see what the differences are between Portuguese and English in terms of the structure of noun phrases. Now, in linguistics, we often talk about these things that we call noun phrases, and we recognize that there are different approaches to this that I talked about earlier. For some theories, it has become absolutely necessary to deal with these as determiner phrases, as DPs, and that's what we're going to do in here. But we recognize at the same time that there are other theories that don't do that, and when we talk about sort of just in a general broad sense, we talk about NPs or noun phrases, and that kind of floats across different areas. So if you're doing typology, linguistic typology, you don't care about all of the little details about the structure of the details about internal structure of phrases and stuff, and so you would just call things noun phrases typically. Although you do find people from various theoretical backgrounds using DP as well. It's not just the particular theory we're looking at. Okay, so what happened here? I don't want to do this. I guess it went backwards. Okay. We note that there can be lots of cases where you can just have a determiner or some other kind of word that is one of the openers. So within noun phrases, there are articles, demonstrative determiners, possessive determiners. These all come, for the most part, just in this one slot right at the beginning. There are a number of other things that are that share similarities with these from a semantic perspective, and that typically come right at the opening. Some of them can also come in different positions, and so it's actually a fairly complicated affair. But what we're going to do in this class is treat a whole class of those things that are typical openers for noun phrases as determiners. So if we look at lots of people were there, but only some were smoking. Some is a noun phrase that's in the middle of that, but it only has this this determiner thing in it. And then you get things, most of the meat was dried, but some was brined and smoked. Some, again, is functioning pronominally, right? It's in there, in that slot, all by itself. And as is typically the case when we do this, there is an interpretation of some that is determined by what? Most of the meat was dried, but some was brined and smoked. Some gets its value from most of the meat, or no, just the meat, right? It gets its value from meat. So it's like some meat, most of the meat is one kind of thing. Some meat is another. No, notice here that the most of the meat is itself a noun phrase, right? Of some kind, right? And what is the thing that opens it? Most, right? Most is in that same category with some. Some of the meat, most of the meat, all of the meat, all those kinds of things. Those are quantifier determiners. And some people would treat that as a separate lexical category, a separate syntactic category, and give it the label Q. This is something that you could do, right? It would be a different category. But what happens is that whatever is a Q is only one version of a noun phrase. The thing that is giving something a quantifier. So you'll see sometimes in the literature quantifier phrases. And quantifier phrases are headed by quantifiers like some, all, most, and all of that kind of thing, right? But then if you take something like most of the meat, what kind of distribution does it have in the overall syntax? The same distribution as noun phrases, determiner phrases, whatever you're going to call this class of things. So let's just treat them all as one kind of thing. And if we're going to do that, what kind of thing is it going to be? The one that works best is determiner phrase. Because there are all these kinds of cases where there is nothing but what would be a determiner. Like with this and these. I like these books, but I don't like those. Those is standing there all by itself, the only thing left in that case, right? And again, it's still a case where the value of those is coming from something that was said earlier. It doesn't have to be that way. It sometimes can come, it's just like pronouns, right? You can get the value either from something that came earlier or from the immediate discourse context, right? So I can point to something and say, I like these, right? And it stands all by itself. You do the same thing with some, right? You're looking at stuff laid out on the table and you say, yes, I want some. And that means some of the stuff that's there, right? So these are pronominal-like things, and those are things that are at the head of noun phrases in some sense. So there are all kinds of cases. There were two people at the show, and both were singing, and each was singing. These are quantifier words that are in some sense in the same class of things as these and those. They're different, however, right? The syntax isn't the same. Because the quantifier ones can typically have of and DP after that as their complement, right? Most of the people, or they can be just most people. All people do these things. All of these people do the same thing, right? You have a different syntax. You can't do that with these and those and the and. So they're not exactly in the same class of things, but we know that any class of words that you find will have differences in the range of things that it can take as its complements. So verbs, some of them take PPs as complements, prepositional phrases complements. Others take noun phrases, or what we're going to be calling determiner phrases. Others take clauses. Some of them take all three as possible complements. So that's not really, the fact that these and those don't always behave the same as some and most and all doesn't mean that they're not members of the same class. There are other ways of dealing with differences in behavior without saying you're a different syntactic category. Okay, so that's the general approaches to do this. Now, one of the things that we know about in terms of trying to figure out what the arguments of things are, or what the complements of things are, that when we talk about arguments, words will have semantic arguments. Verbs that are transitive have as one of their arguments the object of the clause, right? I saw the movie. The movie is a noun phrase that is an expression of the semantic argument, one of the semantic arguments of C. And things like that, when you have semantic arguments, those arguments are going to be realized as phrases in the syntax. And they're going to often be able to be left out, and then you understand that they're left out and you reconstruct the meaning for what that phrase would be if it were there. So the owners of these cars were arrested. Here we have owners is not clearly not a quantifier determiner, right? It's a straightforward, just a regular straightforward noun. But it has as a complement, nouns can have complements, nouns have arguments. If you take any verb and turn it into a noun, that noun will have the same arguments that the verb has. But the difference is that with nouns, in English and many other languages, with nouns it's very easy to leave the arguments, the semantic arguments, implicit. That's something that we do all the time. But it's often constrained by context. You can't do this. They take owners, for example. Owners actually requires that there be a complement, usually, right? You can't walk in out of the clear blue, just come out of the clear blue and say, the owners know that blah, blah, blah. You have to have something in mind, right? You have to have already set up a context in which you know what kind of owning you're talking about, right? So we have context like this. These cars were abandoned here because the owners were arrested. The only possible interpretation of that, I think, right, is the owners of the cars, right? Because owners requires that you make some kind of computation like that, and you're going to do it over the previous stretch of discourse, the closest previous stretch of discourse, in order to do that. You can come in and you say, you see a bunch of cars, I wonder who the owners are, but I'm doing it from the context there, right? I'm getting it. So it's just like with other cases of pronominal anaphora. Seems weird to me that they would do such a thing, but it doesn't seem totally crazy. I'm going to get the interpretation of there's this verb seem is always going to be, it's going to have a semantic argument of the person that's doing the perceiving, right? It's a verb of perception by someone. We can make explicit what that argument is. So it seems to me, it seems weird to me, but it doesn't seem totally crazy. When I say seem totally crazy, there's an implicit argument there, right? It's me, right? And that in this case, we often don't put in the perceiver argument because the default is the speaker, right? If I say that seems crazy, then I mean by default that it seems crazy to me, right? But we can fill it in with other things if we want. Yeah.
Where does the verb phrase end?
Oh, sorry. I don't know. It seems. Which one?
Seems.
Seems weird to me that they would after a thing, right? Because seem has actually 3 arguments, right? Seem weird to me, and then the rest, right? That they would do such a thing. So it has a seems can have a tense clause as its argument, right? And when you do that, then you put an it as the subject of seems, right? That's a construction we'll look at later, right? Where you have what's called a dummy pronoun in the subject slot, and all of the semantic arguments. Notice that it there is not a semantic argument. It's just a placeholder because English requires that there be something in the subject slot. There has to be something there, right? If there's nothing if all of the semantic arguments are realized in another way, then you put what we call dummy pronouns, or there's other terminology, I don't know, make up crap for this, pleonastic pronouns, expletive pronouns. I don't know why expletive. I thought expletives were like cussing things, but I like the term dummy. That sort of works better. But sorry about that. I did put sometimes I miss those end brackets. He opened the front door of his house. Again, notice that of his house could be kind of their implicit there's something. Doors are always related to something, but whether you want to say there's an when you stop saying that nouns have semantic arguments is unclear. Owners clearly does, right? Mother, something like that, right? There's a sense in which mother, those relational nouns, there's always something that, there's some person that has to be in mind if you even use it, right? Whether door is like that or not, I don't know, but we can clearly say I went inside, right? And there's something missing there with inside. It's a prepositional phrase without its noun phrase complement, right? But the value of that noun phrase complement is gotten from the discourse, just like in these other cases. So this is something that, is all over the place. And the important thing is, or one of the important things is that when you have things that are missing, when you have implicit arguments, missing arguments, those things are going to be phrases, at least in the vast majority of cases. So there's a systematicity about it. The things that are ellipsed or elided, things that can be left out, left implicit, are semantic arguments of things. And semantic arguments of things are phrasal constituents in the syntax. And languages will do this differently. Some languages do it a lot. Do this kind of thing all over the place. English, there are constraints. English doesn't allow this kind of thing. But in Portuguese, this is perfectly normal. You can do this with virtually any verb. You can just leave the object off. It doesn't have to be there at all, if it can be picked up from the discourse. So you can say things like, I know this because my Brazilian friends, when I was first hearing them, I'd be hearing them saying this stuff all the time, like, I went to the movies, and then they asked, did you like? Yeah, I liked very much. And they would, because they just don't understand that you can't do that in English. English requires a pronoun in that slot. And so there are cases where languages will require proforms to be in context that other languages will allow things to be implicit. Some things you'll find routinely in most languages, but other things you won't. Okay. Another thing that that is interesting is that these things that the determiners, especially the quantifier determiners, can be and often are accompanied by PP complements rather than anything else. So some of the people were here and some were not. Where what's implicit there is of the people. Most of my stuff was okay, but a lot got broken. And what have we got left off there? Of my stuff, right? So the value that we're getting for that missing piece there is actually a prepositional phrase. 3 of the books were good, but 2 were horrible of the books, right? So this is a kind of structure that we need to have in some way. Noun phrases, however you're going to characterize them, can have structures like this with just a quantifier and a prepositional phrase. And the way we're going to do this is to say that that's a DP. And noun phrases in general are all going to be DPs because it's the thing that really has to be there in some sense, right? The thing you can't leave out mostly is the determiner thing. Either a quantifier, a numeral. Numerals would be in the class, in some sense, as quantifiers, right? They give you notions of amount relative to whatever the complement is going to be giving you. So we can do this, and then it's really very easy to talk about the situation where you have implicit or elided PPs. You could just have this kind of structure, right? Just leave it off. The argument that I have. One of the claims I'm making, if I have a structure of this general kind, then I'm saying the head of the DP is the D, and that head will have a semantics that would include an argument of some kind, and that argument would be a complement of the D, so of that word. So if we have something like this, every student, well, notice then we're saying that there is an NP, right? But the NP is a part inside of this whole unit that has its own characteristic structure, and that is a complement of the determiner. And so there's a lexical entry would be something like this. You could say that every has a meaning, which means the entire, on a scale of quantity, the entirety is what all means, something like that, right? That's one way of looking at it. There's other ways. And it would have a complement. It would have a number feature. The complement has to be an NP. And with every, it has to be singular, right? The NP that goes with every, that's one of its characteristics, right? Remember that typically that's a feature, a defining feature of the determiners, that they put constraints on the number or mass count value of their complements. And every requires a sort of weird, right? Every student, you're actually thinking of lots of plurality in some sense, right? But the way it works in terms of verb agreement and other kinds of, many of the kinds of grammatical agreement phenomenon is that it's treated as singular, right? Every student is responsible for their own work. Well, it's treated as singular with respect to verb agreement, but with respect to, for various reasons, with respect to pronouns that come later in the sentence, it's natural, in fact, to use a plural pronoun, so you get their own work as a kind of natural consequence of the meaning of every. So it's one of these words that is kind of strange. The meaning is plural in some sense, but the grammatical restriction with respect to certain things, in particular verb agreement, is one that treats it as singular, right? So that's a natural sort of thing. The number is given by the number of the entire phrase and the number value of the determiner. So we can say that the determiner has a number value, and the number value is going to be singular by virtue of it being inherited from the noun. Okay, so what we want to do is to construct a grammar that is motivated by and consistent with the facts. That's what we're after, right? Look at the facts, figure out how things work, have an overall grammar that is consistent with that, and that is built as a result of investigating the facts. So we start out with a basic set of generalizations about how a system works, based on observations about regularities, right? This theory of grammar was, as I've noted, it was a bunch of really smart people looking at all kinds of complicated sentences in English, figuring out what the patterns and regularities were, and starting to build a structure out of that, and then asking each other questions and sharing observations about what's possible and what's impossible. Based on the patterns and regularities, that gives you something to look at in order to figure out the whole system. So but you have to start with an initial set of assumptions. You can't just start from nowhere. And the initial set of assumptions, the most important ones for the theory that we're looking at, are that we have nouns and verbs and the sentence structure is built out of those. And you take those and put them together into phrases, and there's a system for putting the phrases together into larger units. And then as we put it together, we construct hypotheses about how it's all going to work. So we have a hypothesis from what we've looked at. It looks like their noun phrases, in the broad sense, are opened by certain classes of words. And those classes of words have certain properties. They take certain kinds of arguments. What is the range? So the range, we say, would be between noun phrase, so determiners can take noun phrases as their complements. What else can they take? They can take prepositional phrases of the form, typically of the form of preposition plus other determiner phrase embedded within it, right? So we see what the patterns are, we formulate hypotheses, and then we see how they work. And then, we test out our hypotheses, see if they work. If they don't work, then we figure out ways to improve them, improve the model based on what we find, right? That's the game, right? We aren't going to always get it right. And we're going to sometimes just want to hold on to assumptions just because we don't want to go back and start over. But ultimately, we want to be able to evaluate the initial assumptions at some level. Okay, so we're not starting by scratch because we're using Chomsky's theory. Did I already do this? This seems familiar. Did I go? I must have, right? I probably said this in some form. We're using Chomsky's theory. We start out with assumptions like their phrases and words are endocentric. That means that they have a head, and the head is the same as the category that they go with. Another assumption that we're going to make is that there's a fairly small set of universally available syntactic categories. What exactly that set is it is continuous. It's always sort of up for grabs in some sense, and people will have slightly different takes on it. But the general Chomskyan view, the principles and parameters model, the universal grammar model, is that those things are universal, and there is a relatively small set. And among the ones that you would find in language after language would be at least noun, verb, adjective, determiner, preposition, and some others. So we're going to build the theory mainly around those categories and see how far we can get with it like that. And then we're assuming some version of the DP hypothesis, the DP story, the one according to which noun phrases are actually headed by, the typical ones are headed by determiners. Articles, possessive determiners, quantifiers. And then here's a big one, that there can in principle be null elements of various kinds, and that tree structures can undergo transformation. If we look and we see there are various kinds of things that you can use. Based on the patterns, you figure out what would be defining characteristics of different categories. We've looked at sort of what nouns and adjectives, where there are lots of defining properties. With other categories, it's less clear. So if you take the category of preposition, how the heck do you know what's a preposition and what isn't? It's not very easy, right? But we know that kind of intuitively there are all these things like in and out and into and through, and it's a fairly small class. And they're mostly about locative relations, about the relationships between things in space. But they're not all like that. And it's not really, it's not a trivial problem. It's hard to define them. We can find some things. So at least in the case where you've got locative prepositions, there's actually a degree word that belongs just to prepositions. Why is it this way? I don't know, but that's the way it is. Right. There are a couple of other kinds of things like this, but right only goes with prepositions. But the problem is that it only also goes with the locative ones. So it's no good to tell you that with is a preposition, although we're going to treat with as a preposition just because that's what we've always done, and you have to treat it as something. And it has the same, the same basic kind of distribution. But there are things like this. So you can't use right with verbs or adjectives, right? Except in some dialects where right will go with adjectives. In the South, I think, right? He was a right smart person, right? That's fine. But so it depends on the. So we have a right would be a word. It would have a syntactic category of a, where we mean a would be adjective, adverb, thing, modifier of a phrase. We're going to use that. That general idea that there's a includes adjectives and adverbs. And this would be one of those kinds of things and has a particular meaning. And exactly how many categories we don't know. A word that we think of as fundamentally one thing can belong to different classes. We have to be aware of that. I shoveled a lot. I used a big shovel. A word doesn't necessarily have a different category just because it can appear in different positions. And we can have things like this, right? The decoration around the fireplace was made using some Italian white marble. Italian white marble, the whole thing is a noun phrase, right? White is an adjective, marble is a noun, but we can put Italian white marble, that whole thing, in a slot where it's modifying fireplace. And that doesn't mean that it has changed into an adjective, does it? Not necessarily, right? We just have we can look at it in different ways. So a whole phrase can also sometimes appear in a slot that is typically occupied by a single word. So all of these things, to figure out how this all works, you have to be aware of. A lot of very old people from the other town were seen in the, we see here that a lot, well, what is the structure of a lot anyway, right? What does it consist of? A lot? What kind of a thing is that? Yeah,
It's a TP.
Huh?
It's a TP.
Yeah, the whole thing, a lot of very old people from the town were seen. There's a big phrase there, right? A lot of very old people from the other town is all one phrase, right? And what's the thing that what's determining the form of the verb? The verb has to be in the form, the verb be has to be in the form were rather than was when what happens? The subject is plural, and either third person or first person plural, right? So we were, but also it's kind of a bizarre system, right? But clearly then this has to be plural, but how do we know it's plural? We know it's plural because of a lot? Is a lot enough to tell us that it's plural? No, because we can have a lot of worthless junk was, right? So a lot isn't telling us that. What is telling us it? The people, right? So there's a complex structure here where there's an overall phrase, there's a noun phrase. What, I got it wrong here, right? Did I write this wrong? It doesn't need a singular noun, count noun complement, right? Does it? It needs a, I don't know what I did here, I don't know what I was thinking. It needs a singular minus bounded, right? Doesn't it? Because it can take either, it needs to have something inside of it that is either plural or mass, right? So that I should say, yeah, there we go. Needs a, what was I doing? What was I thinking here? Oh, I was thinking of, okay, so no, it's complicated, right? There's an there, right? What does it need? It needs to have a singular count noun. That's, I don't know what I was thinking here, right? Is a determiner, right? It needs to have a singular count noun. Lot seems to be the one that's doing that, right? Lot is a singular count noun. But a lot together as a group requires a minus bounded noun complement, right? So that's a complicated set of affairs, right? Requires a singular count noun. Lot fills that slot. So here we actually have a construction in which lot noun has what as its complement? A PP, right? Consisting of very old people, right? And that inside of it, the PP then has inside of it a DP, presumably, or NP, at least one of those, right? That has at the bottom there's a noun inside of it, right? So there's a sense in which, yes, it makes sense when people were thinking about this, oh, these are noun phrases, because central to them will be often, most of the time, either some kind of noun or a noun that's been elided, right? Or that's implicit. So that's the way it works. But so there are two things going on. There's the nature of the determiner, and the determiner putting constraints on the nature of what the noun can be. And sometimes these can go in combination with things and give you complex scenarios like this. So it's hard to even say it's hard to draw a tree for this would be difficult, and I'm not sure that you can actually say for sure what it would be. But here we have to have something that's plural, or we have to have the verb has to have a plural subject, right? There has to be a plural subject, and that subject is plural by virtue of a noun that's embedded far down inside of it. Yeah?
So are plural nouns automatically not, or minus bounded?
Yeah. Yeah. You'd have to say that, right? Because that's the way that the grammar works. The grammar is telling us that there's a category of things there, right? And the lot, how do we know? You can even test it, right? How do we know that lot is a singular count noun? Because it goes with one, right? Second, it can be pluralized because you can count them, right? And then you would have what? And then it turned out that lots is the same way, right? Lots works just like a lot. Lots of people were seen, right? Lots of stuff was taken. And it too has the same exact set of constraints. Why is that? Because lots, although it's historically a noun, and a lot, although it's historically a noun phrase, has developed into a quantifier, right? Semantically, it's a quantifier. And then, so therefore, it's functioning just like one. And quantifiers are these things that put constraints on the noun that has to be in their complement. All they really care about at some level is, I need a noun in my complement, or an implicit noun in my complement, or an implicit noun somewhere. But that implicit noun has to be of a certain grammatical and semantic form. And lots, or a lot, want that noun to be grammatically singular and semantically minus bounded. That would be minus bounded, remember, is giving us a generalization over count over mass and plural nouns. Because the grammar of English is saying, well, look, I care about that particular group, mass and plural, together as one thing. Okay, so we get the whole plural subject that determines the form of the verb is a complex thing that has all of that going on. Okay. And we talked about this, right? That we can have things like this. We can have idioms. The wealthy always get by, and the very wealthy manage to make more money, where that's a combination of things that it's syntactically separate pieces that have to be listed as having a special meaning in the lexicon, right? It means the wealthy people. And then you have other things like over the hill, where over the hill doesn't have any meaning that has anything to do with hills and over, literally, right? And then we've got all of these kinds of constructions like this, where we just need to suck it up, where it doesn't refer to anything at all, right? Where does it get its value from? Nowhere at all, right? It's a dummy, empty pronoun that is there just because, for whatever reason, we made up this combination of things, and we do this all over the place, right? So we have idioms, and then we have regularities about what we intuitively think of as phrases that help us decide what analysis to give them. So every team could use that over the hill guy. You can see how good he is. That over the hill guy is a unit, right? Because the pronoun gets its reference from that. So pronouns get their values from phrases, phrasal constituents that have come before. That guy, just like in this case, right? I was talking about this tall guy, not that one. Now, one is going to get its value from. I was talking about this tall guy, not that one. One gets its value from tall guy, right? So what does that tell us? One isn't looking for a noun, actually. It's looking for some other kind of phrasal constituent that comes before it, right? So it is but it's not looking for a DP. It doesn't ever take a whole DP as its complement. So we start out, here's our hypothesis. Only whole constituents of a sentence can serve as the antecedent of a pro form. We see cases where that's happening, that we know that pronouns are looking for DPs or noun phrases. We look at other things, and then we can use that as a test, right? So some of the people were there, and some were not. Here we see that things that can be elided are also things that are phrases. PPs of the people. Most of my stuff is okay, but a lot, and then the PP that goes with a lot can be elided, and we get that sort of thing. Right? Then we also get it. So the important thing is here that we've got some cases. We see that these PPs, leave them off all over the place. You can leave off. You can elide nouns in certain cases, sub-noun phrases of various kinds, and then you can do it with verb phrases as well. I could finish this project today, but I might not, and I'm leaving something off there, right? And it's not that. So this is a construction in which we are able to reconstruct the meaning of it, even though the stuff isn't there, right? And there's only one way to reconstruct it, right? There isn't a variety of ways. You have to understand the missing piece as being the phrase that came earlier. We start with the hypothesis: only whole constituents of a sentence, things that are phrases, or maybe Words are whole constituents, right? Phrases are other things that are whole pieces. Maybe only those can be elided. Okay, so then the structure would be some of my stuff was stolen and some was not. And we have this complex relationship where the number value of the complement NP that is required for somewhere down in there determines the value of the whole thing. Somewhere now if we take it further, we can start to test things, right? So some very wealthy people, we start to do complicated structures now. We look at the simple ones. Now we say, well, we know we've got whole big complicated determiner phrases. We've said we're going to start with that assumption. And so if we have some very wealthy people from Davis, some is going to be the head, it's going to be the determiner, but the thing determining the number of the whole thing will be people. And then we see that we've got some very wealthy people from Davis pay a lot of taxes, but some don't. The second part there has almost no structure at all. Why can we do that? We can do that because we have this knowledge that when we leave stuff that should be there off, its value can be gotten from phrases that came before. And so it's because we know we have the knowledge of what can be a phrase and what the internal structure of sentences is. That stuff can be very quickly computed and reconstructed. Right? So we're allowed to elide lots of stuff. Some very wealthy people from Davis pay a lot of taxes, but some sorta don't. Some sorta don't would be okay, right? That would mean some very wealthy people from Davis sorta don't pay taxes, right? That's okay. That meaning is okay. But where you want the meaning to be some sort of wealthy people from Davis don't, it's no good, right? You can't get that interpretation. Why not? Because wealthy people from Davis itself is not a subphrase. That's not a phrase, right? Why isn't it a phrase? What's the problem there? Why doesn't that work? What is that telling us? Why would wealthy people from Davis, in principle, that is a phrase, right? But in this particular sentence, it isn't. Why not? Because very is inside of the what you're trying to get the antecedent from. And so therefore, that stuff that you're leaving, the part that's elided there, where it's attempting to elide, to just get its reference from the part that is excluding very, can't do that, can't even compute it. Because what that's showing is that with respect to complicated structures, our hypothesis is making the right prediction. It's predicting that you shouldn't be able to do that kind of thing. So we look at lots of cases like this and we see how it works. We also can do this. Some very wealthy people from Davis pay a lot of taxes, but some sort of wealthy ones don't. That's fine as well, right? Because why? Because we have a principle. We know how it works, right? Proforms, pronouns of various kinds, can get their values from whole pieces, from the phrasal constituents. And people from Davis we know to be, that makes sense, right? People from Davis would be modified by wealthy. Wealthy would be something that could hold of that whole unit, right? People from Davis. And so that's telling us then that people from Davis must be itself a subconstituent, right? Does it make sense? At least that's your default hypothesis given what the fact is. In fact, what I'm doing here is going through the classic argument for a certain model of the DP. And it was based primarily on the way that the pronominal one in English works. And English is a kind of a really nice language because it has this thing. Most languages don't have anything like that. They do ellipsis, but that's all they have, right? They only have ellipsis. They don't have the, it's a really sort of Germanic thing. And the Germanic languages even mostly don't do it very much. But it's nice. So we can then we can see, we actually get then a validation of our hypothesis about ellipsis, because ellipsis and pronominal 1 work in the same way. So we get harmonious evidence for what the nature of that dp must be. The very wealthy people from Davis pay a lot of taxes, but those from Vacaville. Well, I guess you could probably here mean something else, right? Because those has the possibility of not getting its interpretation just from ellipsis. But you can certainly do this, right? That's the default interpretation. The very wealthy people from Davis pay a lot of taxes, but the ones from Vacaville don't. What that's showing us is that, very wealthy people must also be a subphrase of the whole thing, right? So we use this one and ones and see how it works over a range of different noun phrase structures to see what the subconstituents are, what the subphrases are. And we do that with other things. We do it with ellipsis, we do it with ones. The very wealthy people from Davis pay a lot of taxes, but the sort of ones don't. Is that right? No good, right? But it's subtle, right? You have to go to kind of it's a problem. One of the problems with doing this kind of work is that you've got to construct sentences that are ungrammatical, and you're going, can you even do that, right? Is one of the difficulties. And then sometimes when you do that, you go, I don't know. Well, I can, well, maybe, I guess you could say that, but it's not always entirely clear. So then where we're getting from all of this, right, is taking you through the whole, in gory detail, the underlying logic, the way that this model was constructed. And that's, sort of in a half hour, what happened over a period of 20 years with a bunch of smart people working this all out and working on the thing. And unfortunately, just to warn you, it probably ultimately doesn't work, but we'll leave that aside. There are people some of those very smart people, some of the smartest of them, came along later recently and said, you know what, there are some facts out there that would make this questionable. But the facts are extremely complex and convoluted, and so most people don't even worry about it, but it probably ultimately isn't perfect. Okay, so we have then a structure like this. We've got a determiner, D, we use the category with a label D, that is going to be the head of the whole thing. And then what we have to have is some kind of intermediate phrases within the noun phrase. Because we know that some of those different pieces have phrasal status. It's not just a flat string, right? They're grouped into different ways within the structure. So this is the basic idea. We're going to have, within the noun phrase, there are going to be sub-noun phrases of various kinds. And the basic idea here is that you have at the head of a noun, so the head of a noun phrase is going to be a noun. People is that thing. But people can be modified by adverbial or adjectival, right? Across the range of things, we're going to see that all of the phrase types are going to have the same basic structure. Verbs will have things that can be added to them to restrict their meaning, or to set their meaning in terms of a time or place or a manner or something like that. And they come in the form of adverbs when it comes to verbs, and prepositional phrases as well. When it comes to nouns, the typical things are also prepositional phrases, and in this case, adjectives. But we're just going to say that adjectives and adverbs are just versions of the same thing. They're adnominal and adverbal modifiers. Sometimes they're add things, right? And so we've got an AP, and those can be phrases themselves, right? In most cases, they're they're different than noun phrases and verb phrases and such, in that they typically have very little more in terms of internal structure than being able to be modified by an adverb or degree word like that. Adjectives, adjective phrases, when they are serving this function as modifying a noun and coming before it, don't ever have a very complex structure. They tend to be just single units, but they can be modified by these adverbial things. And then we also have prepositional phrases that can go in there. And so the basic system is one in which we can adjoin or kind of stick into the structure in certain slots that we're giving in the structure these adjunct modifiers. Notice that what's key about these things is that they are not arguments of the noun. They're not semantic arguments. People, that concept, doesn't include within it the concept of place that you come from, right? That's just stupid to think that way, right? Nor does it people doesn't intrinsically bring up, there's no necessity to bring to mind degree of intelligence, right? People is a much more encapsulated concept. Right? So because those things are not semantic arguments, they are treated as different things in the syntax, and what we call them is adjuncts. So we have structures like this. I know hella really lame people from Davis, and some that are only kind of lame, and that can mean some really lame people from Davis, can it? Well, maybe it can't, right? Because I'm repeating lame later on, right? So I've factored that out. But it certainly can mean some really I guess what we want to change here is that we could make this better by having it not that are only kind of lame, but that are also really weird. That would work, right? And we're getting that whole thing as being a constituent. I didn't really construct that very well. I know hella really lame people from Davis, and some that are only kind of lame would have that kind of structure, right? And that's the part that is being elided. And then if we do that, the number value of the whole thing comes from the noun that has been elided, right? People is going to give us that. So we get the verb agreement and so forth. So determiners function like pronouns because the value of all or part of their noun phrase complement can be computed from context. And then we could also do this, right? I know a hell of really lame people from Davis, and some, from Vacaville too. Then I'm getting the value for the elided part is getting its value from what? I know hella really lame people from Davis, and some really lame people, right? And so then we know that really lame people is what? Oh, wait a minute. I got a problem here, right? What's the problem? It's not shown as a constituent. That's not a whole unit. But I can get that interpretation, right? So then I have to go and what do I have to do then? The facts here don't match the structure, right? So what do I do? change the structure or change my assumption, right? So if I don't have a way of representing that that's consistent with the theory, then what I would have to do would be to say, you know what, we were wrong. Ellipsis of this kind is not key to phrasal constituents. I was wrong. Back to the drawing board, or whatever, right? So what we want to do then is to say, well, you know what? Maybe there's a way of having that be the case. What we want is really this, right? And then we have the right result. This is a constituent, right? That is a phrasal unit. So how is that? Why? I just drew the tree differently. But the deal is that I drew the tree in such a way that adjuncts, these things that we can put on either side of a noun, adjectives, prepositional phrases, can be put in at any level in the structure. We don't care about where they're done. They just have to follow the system. And the system is, what we call these things, we have noun phrases, and then below them we have n-bar. They're called n-bars because the original people that started doing this put a line over the top, and they called that a bar. But then, because they couldn't do that on typewriters, which they were using back in the old days, it was hard to draw them in all over the place, they started putting a prime symbol that you could do with a typewriter, but they still call them n-bar. We have NP, n-bar, and we can put as many n-bars as we want. That's the system. As many as you need. Throw in the adjuncts wherever you want them. And you can arrange them in different orders. So the adjective can come higher up than the PP or lower down. And they can, so the adjuncts are mobile to a large extent. There are some constraints, but in general, adjuncts are going to be easily moved to different slots in the structure. But our structure then has to be articulated enough as to allow us to put them in at different slots. And there's got to be constraints on how it works. So the basic structure of the noun phrase then is going to be one in which we can have variety of different adjuncts. And among the kinds of adjuncts that you can get, so now we're taking it further. How far do we need to go with this? And we're getting the whole structure here of some really smart people from Davis that are only kind of lame. That's all one big DP, right? And it's headed by some. And you could put other things in that slot. You could say, these really smart people from Davis that are only kind of lame. 3 really smart people from Davis, and so forth, right? Because that slot allows for a range of different determiners. You could put the in there, you could put those, the whole range of things for the most part. And so we have a structure, a very well-articulated structure in which we can also throw in, what's that kind of thing at the top there where I put an S over it, that are only kind of lame? What do we call that? You guys know the term for that? Relative clause. Okay. Relative clauses are those that are hard to recognize. You don't know, you don't see them maybe a lot because it's a little bit confusing because we know that there are other kinds of things where we use this that plus sentence and it's not a relative clause, and so people get confused. And you don't really have to learn it, I guess, right? If you're going to learn how to write and stuff. You kind of do, but you don't have to be able to label these things. You just kind of intuitively know because we know where these things can go and where they can't go. Notice that the structure of that is we have a that, and then we have the regular parts of a clause, but we have something missing in that clause, right? What's missing? The subject of our only kind of lame, right? And where do we get the value for the subject of our only kind of lame? Where does that come from? It's actually, we get the value, right? It's automatically computed. It's computed from what? From the rest of the DP, right? The value is that the stuff that it's modifying. You fill it in. There's some kind of process, and that's like how exactly that happens is one of the big questions at some level of syntactic theory, because this is the kind of processing that's needed in order to get the right interpretation for this is complex, right? You have to be able to get it that there's a relative clause because there's a gap. There's something missing in that S, and that it's an S. And it's signaled to some extent by that that's there, but that's not much of a signal. It's pretty small, right? And that there's a gap is hard to compute because you're only getting the evidence that that there's nothing there, right? Not getting overt. There's nothing overtly marking where the thing is. In some languages, they do this by you do it with a pronoun. So you would do things like some really smart people from Davis, that they are only kind of lame. And then you solve the problem in some sense. So that you have languages that do it with what you call a resumptive pronoun. But so it's a complex thing, right? And within this, so there's a theory of this, right? There are slots in which you can put these. There's a constraint on adjuncts that they have to go in certain slots. There's a constraint on relative clauses that they have to go where? Relative clauses have to go at the rightmost level within the noun phrase. There's no other possibility. Right? They might be able to go actually higher up and be modifiers of. In fact, that might be the right analysis here. Is that relative clause is actually a modifier of what? Some. You could stick it up there, right? That might be the right. This is the way it's typically done, but it could actually be, probably is actually higher up as an adjunct of some, right? That's a possible slot. But whatever you do, it's got to be the rightmost thing. It's got to end up as the rightmost thing in the overall entire unit. So there are constraints of that sort. If you're an adjective, where do you have to go? If you're an adjective modifier of a noun, the only possibility in general, unless you set it up with really special circumstances, is you've got to go right before the noun, right? If you're a PP modifier, you have to go where? After the noun. And before the relative clause if you have them all, right? You can't switch the order, can you? Some really smart people that are only kind of lame from Davis. Well, it's just not good, right? It's hard. It's hard to make the computation because there's a general processing constraint that says the biggest things go last to make it easier to process, right? Okay, so that's we have heads, and they're going to be the ones that are labeled with no P's or bars or anything like that. And then we have complements, and those are going to be the things that are in the structure right next to the heads. The heads are going to want their complements right next to them. Sisters is the relationship that we're talking about here, right? So we have some would have it's going to have a lexical entry. It's going to say my category is D. I have a complement that is an NP, and it's got to be, that NP has to be minus bounded. And the number of that NP is the same as my number, and all of that, right? So that NP, which I couldn't draw on here, so I put it as I did that little line to show you what it's got to be. It could be fleshed out in all kinds of ways. It just has to have in there somewhere a plural or mass noun, and then the complement thing, what the lexical entry is saying, you need to be in a complement structure. The noun phrase needs to be right next to the head. So we're going to have like a very general structure for phrases, and it's going to be like this. You have a phrase, it's any category you want, make it D, make it N, make it V, make it P. Prepositional phrases, verb phrases, they're all going to have the same basic structure, where you're going to have at the bottom, at the very bottom, you're going to have the sisters here. The sister of the head is going to be its complement. So that's it makes sense, right? We have a structure that is a reflection of the meaning, is what we're doing, right? At some level. We're saying, yeah, we know that there's this stuff you have to know, number, meaning, and we're going to have the structure be a reflection of that and keep it consistent across a lot of things. So the sisters are those things that are like this and have the same mother in the tree. And so the complement will be the sister of a head. All right? And then we have adjuncts, all of these different kinds of things. And those are defined in terms of the structure of the phrase. So the adjuncts, which you can have a bunch, right, are going to be, they're defined as the sister and the daughter of an X bar. So that's why we have all of these we can have the noun phrase broken up into a series of smaller phrases. And those smaller phrases are noun-like. They have the noun flavor, but they're not whole NPs themselves. They're sub-NPs of a certain variety that we're going to call N-bars. And the adjuncts are stuck up into the slots in this way. So they typically modify the potential reference of the sister phrase or its head. Either way you want to look at it. So the relationship is that. All phrase structure, we're going to say, is of this kind. There are heads, there are complements, there are adjuncts, and they go into the slots that we have defined for them. So this is called the X-bar schema of phrase structure. It replaced the phrase structure rules that the theory of transformational grammar started out with. It's first introduced, well, it's in work by Ray Jackendoff. You can, if you want to go back and look at this stuff. Ray Jackendoff's version of this was more complex. He was one of the people at MIT in the late 60s that was inventing this based on the kinds of things we were looking at today. Complex sentences and how you can pick them out with things like ellipsis and one anaphora and all of that kind of stuff. And he elaborated one of the early versions of this. But the one that we're looking at comes from a book by Chomsky and called Barriers in 1986 that has essentially this character. Chomsky didn't actually have the DP part of it. That comes a little bit later, but everything else here is consistent with that. So what we'll do next time is we'll come back and we'll say, okay, now we've got sort of the story. I'm giving you like a fairly gory picture of the story, right? And then we're going to come back and look at, well, how about the VP? What does the VP look like? And what you're going to see, what's going to be neat, is that the VP has all of the same basic schematic structure. We have heads and complements and adjuncts and the same kinds of, even more, lots of evidence for what the internal structure is. Okay.